So, welcome everyone to the first lecture of this new lecture season of the Theosophical Society Point Loma, with the theme Awakening Universal Wisdom Within Yourself. This lecture series also serves as an introduction to our course Universal Wisdom, which will start again in November. And hopefully tonight we can explain why we think everyone should take this course. For those of you who are attending a lecture of ours for the first time, I will first briefly introduce who we are. The Theosophical Society was founded in 1875 by H.P. Blavatsky and others in New York. In short, its goal was to spread the ideal of universal brotherhood by showing that all life is essentially one. This wisdom can be found in all times and traditions. The Theosophical Society is therefore part of the much larger universal theosophical movement that is continuously active in spreading wisdom and compassion for the sake of brotherhood and peace in the world. Theosophy is a term for this wisdom and literally means wisdom of the gods or divine wisdom, referring to the divine origin of all life. You could also call it universal wisdom, because it applies always and everywhere. But whether that is so is of course up to each individual to investigate. No one else can do that for you, so we therefore invite you not to take anything for granted. Now I have divided the lecture into 3 parts. The title Discovering the Inner Cosmos obviously suggests that there is an inner cosmos. But what is that? We will, of course, explore this. We will define cosmos and inner cosmos further in the second part when we will discuss cosmic laws. But why would you even look for this? And why is it so important to explore it further? We want to start by considering that, because we believe that inner wisdom is exactly what the world is lacking now. And we explain what we mean by inner in this first part. And we then conclude in part 3 with an explanation of how discovering the inner cosmos leads to a better world. This also serves as a prelude to the Universal Wisdom course. And this course is designed to support you in further discovering the inner cosmos and the inner human being. It will start again on November the 2nd on Sunday afternoons online via Zoom. And we will provide more details at the end of this lecture. After this lecture there will be time for questions, and we especially invite you to participate in the interactive study on Zoom, where we can discuss this in more detail. If you have not yet registered for this, you can send an email to info@blavatskyhouse.org during the short break after the lecture to receive the link. If you are unable to participate in the Zoom study, you can also ask questions via YouTube chat after the lecture. Now there's no question about life that Theosophy cannot answer, so make sure you take advantage of it. Now I'd like to begin with the assertion that every human being strives for harmony. No one will deny that a better world with more harmony is possible. Now one of the most unique human characteristics is our power of imagination. We can all build an image of a better world in our minds. In fact, we all intuitively have an image of a better world. And that is why so many people lament when they see the world as it is today. Everyone will agree that things can be better. Why? Because every human being essentially strives for happiness and harmony. Although everyone has their own image of harmony, whether limited or broad. And of course, our interpretation can vary considerably. But if people did not strive for harmony, but for disharmony, then many people would be happy now. However, during war, violence, conflict, fear, stress, people are obviously not happy. This is not our nature. But what is our nature? And is it the same for everyone? Now, our striving for harmony is a sign of inner wisdom. We humans are not only sensitive, instinctive, or rational beings, we are also moral beings. We can reflect on our actions, and we can resolve to do better next time. We think we could have done better. In this way, we can train our conscience, our inner moral compass. And in general, every human being is inclined to follow their conscience in order to achieve greater harmony and happiness for themselves and for others around them. And every human being is capable of extending this and doing good to others or to the whole. Why then is there so much suffering and evil in the world, so much disharmony? In short, humans have generally failed to discover their inner wisdom and therefore do not follow it. They focus too much on external matters and circumstances, without seeing the relationship with inner wisdom or the lack thereof. You can see that people often tend to believe what others, mostly so-called authorities, tell them, or that they think they have to fight with others for their own interests. They see life as a sort of competition and try to come out on top as much as possible. Or, partly due to the recognition of the above, they become numb, indifferent, and passive. They prefer to hide away and distract themselves with all sorts of things. And of course, the temptations are countless. And often it is a combination of these three. Now, what stands out here? It is mainly in thinking that is limited to the external world and how we think we should respond to it. Of course, it is not so clear-cut with only two extremes. Most people have good intentions. They are decent. But that doesn't mean that they think proactively and independently and act morally in line with their nature, with their inner wisdom. The question is, of all the things that people follow, what have they really discovered within themselves? What have they thought through? What have they really tested? In such a way that we follow it and also live by it. Like Socrates, who said he would always obey his conscience and intuition, his daimon. Or Nelson Mandela, who was willing to sacrifice his life if he could not follow his conscience. Or William of Orange, who continued to fight for freedom of conscience. So how to overcome the disharmony? Throughout history and across the globe, there have always been impulses of universal wisdom. Messengers such as Krishna, Zarathustra, Buddha, Lao Tzu, Pythagoras, Jesus, Plato, Quetzalcoatl, etc. And they all essentially bring the same message. There is wisdom, and that wisdom is within us. Let's take a few of the sayings from these traditions. It is a universal message that we have to discover our inner wisdom. Like the Chandogya Upanishad from India teaches, thou art that. Or the Oracle of Delphi, man, know thyself. Buddha, who talked about that we should work out our own salvation with diligence. Lao Tzu that wrote, those who know others are wise, but those who know themselves are enlightened. Socrates saying, what's the point of knowing about everything if I don't even know myself? And Plato, who on several points in his dialogues points to our pursuit to become like the divine. There's this saying from Zarathustra, because those who know themselves know the all within themselves. And Jesus talked about the kingdom of heaven that is within us. And lastly, Blavatsky, the co-founder of the Theosophical Society, refers to one of the sources of universal wisdom, quoting, "The way to final freedom is within thyself," and also that the key to which makes of a man a god, a bodhisattva. Now, the latter term, bodhisattva, is a term for a divine or a semi-divine being who consciously chooses not to enter the heavenly state of nirvana in order to continue working for all living beings. Now, in all these sayings, we can recognize and see that they all advocate the freedom of thought and conscience and repeat this message that wisdom lies within us and that we must follow it again and again. Now, if all goes well, we are never really telling you anything new, anything you cannot recognize or remember. Why? Because we all share the same origin. And that's also part of this universal message that you find in all traditions worldwide, that we all share one and the same source. Now, as the Chandogya Upanishad talked about "thou art dead," here we see a synonym of this universal message that we are all inseparable parts of one great, all-encompassing whole, a transcending unity, which in Hinduism just is called that. And in the Edda, from the Nordic countries, you find the term Ginungaga, meaning a yawning void. In the Jewish Kabbalah, they talk about Ein Sof, or without bounds. In Buddhism, they call it Sunyata, or emptiness. And in Taoism, you have this first verse of the Tao Te Ching saying, "The Tao that can be named is not the real Tao." In Neoplatonism, they talk about the One. And the Christian Gnostics about Bitos, or the deep. In Islam, we have, of course, this term Allah, which really means the all. And in the Popol Vuh from Guatemala, they talk about the great sea of space. So you see, they all talk about something that hardly can be named, that doesn't have any characteristics, that is like space, like emptiness, like a void, without any bounds. But this source, this something, is not something external, but something internal, something spiritual. And that is why all these messengers continuously point to ourselves. And but by that they mean inward, to our most inner self, our inner being, who is in essence equal with this source that they also talk about. But what exactly do they mean by that word inner? What is inner? If you talk about inner wisdom, self-knowledge, it of course indicates a direction. But it's not an external or material direction. And it's not about knowing, for instance, how many moles your skin has. But it is a spiritual direction. And that can also go deeper and deeper. It is essentially infinite. For example, you can experience within yourself that you can always observe yourself. If you ask yourself this question now, whether that is the case, then you are already an observer of your thoughts. Just as you can observe yourself when you are doing something. Now hold on to that thought for a moment. Because you're now observing your thoughts, but at the same time, you're also observing that you are observing. And when you do that, you're actually observing that you are observing yourself. So you can experience infinitely more deeply that there is something of a presence within you that is always there. Now we are usually constantly distracted or preoccupied with our thoughts and rarely experience that presence consciously. Perhaps during a moment of meditation or walking alone in nature. But some people already taste or experience something of the infinity of this inner source. In the Secret Doctrine, Madame Blavatsky's book on universal wisdom or theosophy, this source is described in the first fundamental principle as follows: an omnipresent, eternal, boundless, and immutable principle, unthinkable and inexpressible. One absolute reality which antecedes all manifested conditioned being. It's a more elaborate way of that same source that is pointed to by in all these different traditions, whether they call it emptiness or the void. And here it's also called a principle, something also without which you cannot give any characteristics. You can only describe it in negations. It's not with, it doesn't have any bounds. It's eternal. It's omnipresent everywhere. Now we also can summarize this principle with the word boundlessness. And the conclusion from this is that behind every phenomenon lies an inner life force. You could say that spiritual consciousness operates through everything. And the one essence of the boundless works through everything. Otherwise, it would not be boundless. And this means that everything is essentially also alive, from atoms to stars. Now, Plato has a simple definition for life and calls it self-motion, the ability to act and to react. And everyone can check for themselves to what extent this applies, including, for example, a molecule or cell, a planet or a star. Now, what does this mean? What does this mean for us as humans? It is also said that man is a microcosm of the macrocosm. As I said, we will return to the word cosmos in the following section, but this already gives you an idea. We have everything within us that is also present in the boundless, present in the boundless cosmos. If something were missing within us, it would also be missing in the boundless whole. And that is impossible because then that whole would not be boundless. So this should not be understood in a material sense, because matter is only the temporary shell in which consciousness clothes itself. And that applies just as much to the atoms of which we are composed. It is consciousness that is essentially infinite or boundless, eternal and imperishable. And it works just as much through or behind those atoms. Now the diagram on the right also shows a three-part composition that is often used in the West, although different traditions make even more detailed divisions in, for instance, 4, 5, 7, 10, or even 12 principles, depending on the level of detail. Now if we follow this threefold division, you can see that our core of consciousness, the imperishable part, also known as the spark of eternity, is also known by the somewhat vague term spirit. And at the other end, you see the perishable part, the vehicle, the body. Although sometimes immaterial parts are also considered part of this vehicle, such as the emotions or the pranas or life currents. The soul is then the middle part, the learning part. And in humans, we express consciousness in the soul through thinking. Now, next week, my colleague Barend Forum will tell you much more about this. So you see that there are different layers from the most inner to the outer. Just as our electricity must also transform through various steps from a power station via the socket to an appliance. What we especially want to emphasize is that as humans, we are much more than we think. we are, in the heart of our heart, equal to the One. As an inseparable part of the One, of the boundless, we essentially have all the abilities within us, up to the most expansive cosmic reaches that we can imagine. We are not a body, we have a body. We are essentially an imperishable, eternal, spiritual being with infinite inner wisdom. And how we can further discover this within ourselves, we will now explain in the following part. And then we focus on the following question: what is the inner cosmos? And we will go into the topic of discovering cosmic laws. Now, in the first part, we considered the concept of inner self and made it clear that universal wisdom, found in traditions worldwide and throughout the ages, tells us that in our innermost being we are equal to the One, to Tao, to the All, to the boundless. Now, in essence, boundless or infinite consciousness, or consciousness per se, is the force behind or through everything that lives, including ourselves. That means we can learn infinitely, discovering new layers within ourselves time and again, and ultimately discovering the cosmos in all its layers, both inner and outer. We will explore this further in this part. Now, that idea of infinity is not only to be discovered within ourselves, in our own consciousness. Because when we just look at the outer world, we can also see infinity. In the small and in the large, we never encounter boundaries, only the boundaries of our own perception. There is an infinity of vibrations, of frequencies, and it is our own limitation, our own limited bandwidth, so to say, that ensures that we can only perceive a small cross-section of them. But with each new particle accelerator, we discover smaller and smaller elementary particles. And with each new telescope, we discover that space, the universe, the macrocosmos, is even more extensive than we already thought. But what does cosmos actually mean? It comes from ancient Greek and literally means order or arrangement. This is a reference to the cosmic laws of nature that create order in the cosmos. But then, what are these laws of nature? Now, based on the idea that everything is alive, that nothing is lifeless, laws can be seen as the habitual patterns of living beings in all kinds of areas and on all kinds of scales. Just as our heartbeat is a law of nature for the cells in our body, we, as human beings, are subject to the movements of the celestial bodies. The rotation of the earth that causes day and night, the moon that causes the tides, the orbit around the sun that gives us the seasons, etc. Now, the fact that our earth rotates is an example of self-motion, this distinguishing feature that Plato mentioned for every living being. And according to that definition, our earth is a living being, just like our sun is. And as above, so below, the cosmos as a whole. Now, what then are examples of these laws of nature, these universal patterns of behavior of all these living beings? Either more or less developed, which together form the cosmos. Now, in the course Universal Wisdom, you will be introduced to these laws of nature under the heading The 7 Jewels of Wisdom. Now, we will mention two of them in this lecture: cause and effect and cyclicity. We begin with cause and effect, also known in the East as the doctrine of karma. The law is that every cause evokes an effect that is identical in character to that cause. Just as the impulse with which you strike one pool ball results in an equal impulse after collision, apart from all frictional forces, of course. Now, cause and effect can be observed all around us. we couldn't even imagine a world without it. Everything we do is based on cause and effect relationships. A very small example: you pick up a glass and you know exactly how much pressure to apply to grip it without it slipping out of your hands or without breaking it. And when you bring it to your mouth, you know how the liquid will behave when you slowly tilt the glass. You know that when you put the glass down again, it won't shoot back up or fall through the table. These are such everyday things for us that we don't even think about them. But if you have to program a robot to do the same thing, you have to calculate and test all of that, probably quite a few times until it finally works. And the fact that you can do this is based on the laws of nature, which we know to a certain extent and which make life predictable. So what we call chance or coincidence is really just a term for a phenomenon whose cause and effect relationship we do not yet understand. Because if chance really played a role somewhere, then chance would actually have to reign everywhere, because everything is connected. And the cosmos would not be the cosmos, but a large, unpredictable, incomprehensible, continuous disorder. Now, is it coincidence if you roll a 6 3 times in a row with a die? Not if you could measure all the forces, the hand position, the mass of the die, the speed, the air resistance, the stiffness of the materials colliding with each other, etc., etc. The law of cause and effect is, in fact, the foundation of science. And this predictability, based on cause and effect, does not only apply to the external realm. We also program ourselves through the thoughts we think and repeat, the habits we form as a result, and thus become somewhat predictable as a certain character. For example, we have learned to remain calm during stressful situations by not focusing too much on fearful thoughts, but by staying focused and observing. And by consistently following the same habit in these situations, we have become calm in character. And so there's also cause and effect between people in all areas in which we interact: emotionally, mentally, spiritually, etc. For example, if you were to lash out angrily at one of your neighbors, it would still be palpable the next time you meet. And if you don't repair that, it will have an effect on your relationship. And this immediately shows that cause and effect is not a blind law, but works from the inside out, from the inner to the outer. Everything is life, and it is life that responds to life. Now, life in the physical realm, the domain of atoms, molecules, and cells, is just much more predictable than in the human realm. And the reason for this is that we as humans have a greater degree of free will with our thinking and do not instinctively behave in the same way all the time. Although even at the subatomic level, the behavior of particles is in essence unpredictable, and one could speak of a certain degree of free will. Now, the philosophical and religious ethical consequences of the law of cause and effect are that all life, therefore, has fundamentally free will, and is therefore also responsible for its own actions, as part of the whole. And we can expand that free will with the development of our consciousness. But at the same time, our responsibility also increases. And this is, of course, only a positive thing, because it allows us to become a co-worker of nature or the cosmos, of the harmony of the whole. Now, the law of cause and effect is closely related to the law of cyclicity, just as sowing and harvesting are related to the seasons. Now, cyclicity can also be observed everywhere. Think of day and night, ebb and flow, sleeping and waking. Or in society, traffic jams during rush hour. Now, cyclicity also works from the inside out and is therefore not blind. We create our own daily rhythm. We have our habits, our cyclical thought patterns. And on a larger scale, a certain mentality allows civilizations to flourish or, conversely, to decline. But many cyclical processes occur instinctively or automatically, such as our blood circulation, our breathing, our digestive cycle, or our biorhythm. We are also subject to larger cosmic cycles, such as the orbit of the moon, the orbit of the earth around the sun, that causes the seasons, or the 12-year sunspot cycle, which in turn causes climate phenomena such as El Niño. Now, sleeping is already an example of the alternation between activity and rest of consciousness. According to universal wisdom, however, death is also a great sleep, in which consciousness temporarily withdraws, only to reappear after a period of rest to learn new lessons. Re-embodiment is therefore also an example of such a cyclical phenomenon. And of course, there is much more to say about this. And in February, we will therefore devote an entire series of lectures with the title The Continuity of Consciousness, Death and After. Now, cyclicity is also closely related to the idea of cause and effect, or karma. For in one lifetime, not all causes can have an immediate effect, just as we cannot immediately reap what we sow in the early spring. And so, of course, there are also many consequences in this life that have their cause in a previous life. And we usually call this coincidence, because we are not yet able to recognize these cause and effect relationships across multiple lifetimes. Now, some philosophical and religious ethical consequences of the doctrine of cyclicity are that there are always new opportunities and that we can grow infinitely in every new cycle. Now, we have now given a brief outline of these two laws of nature. And of course, this requires much more independent research to test and experience for yourself. Now, how can that process of discovery work? Now, discovering essentially means unveiling what already exists. And in boundlessness, everything really is already present and available. It is solely up to us to explore its core or heart and to increasingly see and experience it. Now, in principle, this can be done in two ways. The first way is through external experimentation and repetition, from details to a whole. And this method, also known as inductive reasoning, is the most common in current science. People have moved away from the idea that there is a universally coherent vision. Although in physics, for example, the search for a coherent theory of everything is still ongoing. However, there is no indication that this has been found, and moreover, it only looks at external phenomena. So a truly coherent picture of reality is not yet something from which to start. And the process usually begins with propositions or hypotheses based on experiments that are repeated in a slightly different way, forming a model or theory that approximates reality as closely as possible. And this inductive method, from the details to the whole, has its value, but it is a very slow method, producing many dead ends. It is a bit like trying to find a path to a destination in a dense jungle without a map. You just start walking down a path somewhere and see where it takes you. And you will reach some destinations, but whether you will eventually find your destination is questionable. Another example, suppose an engine is lying in pieces, and you try to make something out of it, to discover how it all fits together, without knowing that it is an engine, or even knowing what an engine is. Now, even if you succeed, it will probably take a very, very long time before you have assembled something that works. Now, the second way is through philosophy and the underlying laws, from the whole to the details. This is also called the deductive method. And of course, the philosophy from which you start is crucial here. For this method to have a chance of success, you must start from a picture or vision of reality that is as universal as possible. We believe that such a view certainly exists and is provided by the universal wisdom that can be found in all traditions worldwide. Now, this deductive method, which was also used by Plato and is therefore also called the Platonic method, goes from the whole to the details, from universals to particulars. And then, because it also encompasses the inductive methods, from the particulars back to universals. Now, what is a reliable way to work with this? It actually consists of three main parts: religion, philosophy, and science. And especially the combination or synthesis of these three, the universal wisdom or Theosophia. Now let us briefly consider each of these concepts. Now at its core, religion is about realizing unity through devotion. Realizing because the one, the boundless, the all, the eternal already exists and will always exist. We are integrally the one, but we can realize that infinitely more deeply and inwardly. Discovery is therefore about unveiling this. In other words, it is about seeing through the illusion of separateness, as the Buddhists call it. Seeing through the idea that we are separate entities. Instead, we are inextricably linked. And recognizing that even our personalities are transient, and that we are essentially spiritually one. Now, religion in its essence, however, is not mere belief or faith. In a belief system or in a faith, people start worshipping something outside of themselves, something for which they need intermediaries who are only too happy to make them believe, and who give themselves a position and thereby also exercise power, consciously or unconsciously. Whereas the true religious spiritual teacher can be recognized, for example, by the fact that they will always point out that you do not need them, because it is all within you. But they will always be there. Because it is precisely because they have increasingly realized unity within themselves that they work with dedication and compassion. And they no longer feel separate, but integrally connected to all that lives. And these more advanced people will therefore always remain active in the foreground or in the background. Now, philosophy is the second component. The word, which comes from Greek, consists of two parts. Philo, which means to love, and Sophia, which means wisdom. So it is usually translated as the love for wisdom. But there's also the esoteric, hidden, mystical meaning of philosophy as the wisdom of love. And love with a capital letter L does not refer to personal love, but love as the binding force that brings everything together, that connects it, that binds it together and governs it. In essence, it is about compassion. And this wisdom of love therefore offers the ultimate knowledge of karma, which consequence can be traced back to its cause. And according to the ancient Greek philosopher Pythagoras, a philosopher was someone who had insight into all the hidden inner things behind the outer phenomena. Someone who understood all cause and effect relations and who saw the truth directly. And therefore Pythagoras himself, in his modesty, refused to call himself a philosopher. Finally, there is science, the domain of research and investigation. And in order to detach itself from dogmatic religion, contemporary science in the West has developed primarily from a limited materialistic philosophy. The idea, in short, that what you cannot see does not exist. But the true scientist does not impose any limitations on his field of research in advance. He is open to all observations, to all experiences and facts. And he investigates the things that are causal and therefore, in most cases, invisible. It is about researching the laws of nature. And because we as humans are a microcosm of the macrocosm, we can also use our inner powers of perception to investigate the cosmos both externally and internally. And by this we mean above all the activation of the higher powers, the philosophical, intuitive, and the religious, mythical, and ethical within us. And you also see that groundbreaking scientists such as Giordano Bruno or Isaac Newton or Albert Einstein, for example, were all also religious and philosophical. So you can already see how these three inner perspectives essentially overlap. They are three ways of finding truth, of discovering universal wisdom. And this is not about all the external sciences, philosophies, and religions, let alone the current faiths. It is explicitly about appealing to the religious, philosophical, and scientific within yourself. And that is within everyone. We have this within us by nature. A child possesses it, and we can continue to develop it. It is inner wisdom. But of course, we can learn from the great teachers of humanity, from Pythagoras to Buddha, from Lao Tzu to Jesus of Nazareth. So it doesn't matter if there is a movement that attracts you, Islam, Christianity, Buddhism, Hinduism, Judaism, Taoism, you can find it there. And especially in the esoteric or more hidden side of it. If you combine them, however, you get an even richer picture. And this is actually the philosophical side, demonstrating the coherence, the universality. So true religion is therefore philosophical and scientific. Because if you want to realize unity more and more, you will use your intellect for that very purpose. And someone who is searching for truth or wisdom cannot be opposed to scientific facts. Something is true or not. And in a universal framework, all the facts must fit. So from a theosophical framework, all scientific facts can be explained in any case. And better than with the current limited scientific theories, we think. So what you are actually doing in this process of discovery is expanding your consciousness further and further, identifying more and more with the one life that beats within the heart of the cosmos. Now let's take a look at the diagram of the composition of our consciousness again. We explained that as human souls, we are the intermediary learning part. And that intermediary part can also be divided into two. We can identify with the spiritual part of ourselves by thinking from the unity that we essentially are. We do this when we think selfless, compassionate, when we cherish universal ideals, when we develop universal knowledge, it are those thoughts that align with the religious, philosophical, and scientific within ourselves. And this part of our soul, as learning human beings, is also the part that transcends outer life. It is what we also call our reincarnating part. And we are all learning to identify more and more with this spiritual or universal to become what we are in essence. On the other hand, all self-centered, limited and limiting thoughts, such as our selfish desires, our tendencies, personal opinions and emotions, are part of our personality. When we identify with them, we are actually identifying with the transitory part, with the temporary vehicle that lives here on Earth and that lasts only one lifetime and then disappears. So all this energy is in fact, you could say, lost. And of course, there is much more to say about this distinction between the impermanent and the permanent part of ourselves. And next week, Barend Forum will elaborate on this. And we will also devote plenty of attention to this in our course, Universal Wisdom. Now let us now give an example of how discovering the cosmic laws works and how it leads, we think, to a better world. Now we will also tell you more about the course that starts in November, in which you will learn how to discover the inner cosmos independently, but just this brief example to give you a taste of what we're trying to do. Now earlier we considered this process of discovering universal wisdom within yourself through the three inner perspectives of religion, philosophy and science. And we would like to zoom in a little more on how that process of discovery works. Now essentially it is about searching for answers to life's questions, going through a number of recurring questions. The what, the purpose or what for of something, the why, and the how. And then also in this logical order. Because you can ask yourself first, why would you want to gain more knowledge? Is it for yourself? Or because you realize that as part of a much larger whole, you have a certain function or responsibility in it? And this is in fact exactly the distinction we made before between identifying with our inner spiritual and imperishable part or with our outer perishable vehicle part, including our personality. Because if you start from that limitation, I think you can forget about finding universal wisdom. But on the contrary, when we open ourselves to it by forgetting ourselves, by seeing the whole, by marveling at the world, and by asking ourselves how can we be a connecting factor, how we can support or help others, then you really open up your vision and will, I think, discover much more. Because if you start from that image, that sense of unity, you immediately make a distinction in what you are looking for. Because what use is knowledge that you are unable to connect with your ethical awareness, with your highest awareness of unity and connectedness. Now let's take the law of karma or cause and effect as an example. If we build an image of this from this idea of unity, then we can build an image of how all living beings are connected to each other with countless ties, like nodes in a gigantic web of life. And when one node moves, let's say for the whole or for itself, it puts all these bonds, all these ties in the surrounding nodes under a certain tension, in a common direction or in the opposite direction. And ultimately, such an individual movement or action passes through all the nodes throughout this entire web. Everything influences everything else, no matter how minimally. And this is therefore a very dynamic picture. And it immediately indicates the purpose, that because of our interconnectedness, we have a responsibility for our actions in relation to the whole. So this is the start from the religious point of view. Now, if you move on to the why, to learn to see the connection between the seemingly unrelated phenomena, the philosophical view, then one of the most pressing questions regarding karma in our time is, why is there so much suffering? And where is justice in this world? Now, all the injustice that takes place seems to go unpunished. And answers such as, it's just bad luck, or it's God's will, or the belief that it will be righted forever in the afterlife, are actually just quite evasive. But if you continue to reason in terms of cause and effect, there is clearly much that escapes us. And that is why it is important to always consider the universal laws of nature in relation to each other. Because if you assume that there is cause and effect, and this cannot be properly understood without the idea of infinity, eternity, and cyclicity, then we are not able to recognize these cause and effect relations across multiple lifetimes. And then things seem to happen to us by chance from the perspective of just a single lifetime. Or it seems that people get away with the injustice they have done to others. Now, during a violent storm in the middle of the ocean, it is quite difficult to imagine that the raging sea can also be as smooth as glass. And similarly, at the time when a mental storm is raging and tensions are being discharged in disharmonious human actions, it is difficult to imagine that there will come a time when all this will have worked itself out. But the difference is that we ourselves must actively work towards this. Every thought, word, or deed against the whole, which out of free will is retaliated with another thought, word, or deed against the whole, just perpetuates this storm. Now, there are no coincidences, nor are we merely puppets in the hand of a god or of gods. There's always free will, and every action has its consequences. So we are always responsible for our actions, whether we recognize this or not. Nature is just, even if it sometimes seems otherwise, because out of ignorance about the unity of life and the laws of the cosmos, we sometimes use our free will to work against that unity, which of course will have consequences in this or a future life. And then we can show again what we are worth, whether we have learned our lessons. Then there is the question of how it works, how it leads to what you perceive, internally and externally. And this is the phase of science, of investigation. And here you can investigate the patterns that you can observe. And if you do this in the universal scientific way, as we described before, you also take inner causes into account. Now, every action, every deed is preceded by a thought, by a certain motive, conscious or unconscious. Now, what is the quality of that thought? And what actions does it lead to? And what are the consequences? Now, it is easy to judge others, but we can never be certain about someone else's inner motive. But what we can do is work on ourselves as best as we can. And it helps to keep in mind the above, the unity of everything, the inseparable connection, and our responsibility that arises from it. And these thoughts prevent selfish thoughts of revenge, of hatred or violence from taking root in us and ultimately turning into action. And in doing so, we become a shining example for others, inspiring and influencing them much more than any punishment or sermon ever could. Now then, the final step is to return to the bigger picture, Now, with your broader perspective, in this case, for example, of a teaching such as karma, you can test which thoughts are correct and which are not, and what this means for your actions in light of the whole. Now, some people sometimes tend to distinguish between, for example, your karma and my karma. They say that's his or her karma, and that's often used as an excuse to act on one's own behalf. Now, if you start from a basis of unity and of how everything is connected, then there is no such thing as my karma or your karma or his or her karma. It is all our collective karma. And in a sense, you are always complicit. Now, there is a wise saying from the Bhagavad Gita that says, the duty of another is full of danger. But this means much more that you should not stand in the way of the inner wisdom from which someone must learn to act independently. Simply put, you do not teach someone by something. You do not teach someone something by doing it for them. So it doesn't mean that it's not your karma, it just means that you have to help others to resolve their own karma. Now, and if you rebuild that picture, if you use these 3 phases in this process, you can also ask 3 check questions, which correspond to these 3 parts, namely starting from religion or our greatest realization of unity. The first question is it universal? Can you recognize it as a law that applies always and everywhere? Does it fit with everything else you know? And is it coherent and does it offer an encompassing insight? This corresponds to the philosophical phase. Then you can ask, is it logical? Does it build on your previous conclusions? Does it match your knowledge, experience, and observations in other areas? As above, so below. And can you use it to explain and to predict? And is this also correct? And then the third question, corresponding to the religious phase, is it ethical? Is it according to your broadest view and understanding of unity? And the touchstone here is always that overall picture of unity, that picture of connectedness and how we can think, act, or live as one and interconnected as much as possible. Because if we are one and interconnected, then to live accordingly is the most important thing we have to learn. And every lesson that adds to our image of unity in this journey of discovery, that broadens our vision of the interconnectedness of life, is a life lesson never to forget. Like Plato said, to know truly is to be. So it is of no use to learn about cosmic laws such as karma if you do not express this in the practice of your own life. And that is the true religion. As we have said, the realization or awareness of unity through devotion by practicing it day in, day out, 24/7. Now, with karma and reincarnation, for example, you can conclude that everything that happens to you is something you have attracted yourself. In short, the world is like a mirror for ourselves. And this may be a bit confrontational, but it is also hopeful, because it also means that you yourself have every opportunity to do something about it. It points to our free will and personal responsibility. So in short, improve yourself, improve the world. And that is what we mean by identification, that you also start living these universal laws, to bring the inner cosmos in yourself to life and to really show that you know something because you have become it. Now, this is a first quick sketch of what universal wisdom has to offer. Based on a number of universal core ideas that we started with, that there is universal unity, that each of us, every living being, is also that unity at our core, and that we are capable of developing and growing more and more from within, in communality. And we hope we have been able to demonstrate that unity, that brotherhood, that ethics, and human solidarity are really ingrained in nature, ingrained in the cosmos. And inwardly, that we are one with all that lives. And bringing this to life is the key to a better world, to the realization of universal brotherhood. And by realization, we mean first and foremost awareness, because universal brotherhood is a fact. And from this awareness, you will also realize this more and more in this outer world. For the same laws of cyclicity and cause and effect, or causality, form the order throughout the cosmos and are applicable to all life. And we as humans are learning to consciously discover these laws. And we have told you how that process of discovery can work, how you can increasingly identify with it, and that it ultimately leads to becoming more and more what we essentially are, active co-workers of nature, of the cosmos. Now, hopefully you have already concluded for yourself that this will lead to a better and more harmonious world. Now, how can you proceed from here? Now, like I said, in November, our Universal Wisdom course will start again, in which you will continue to discover and explore universal wisdom on a weekly basis together with a group of fellow students. And this course covers topics such as the 7 jewels of wisdom, universal cosmic laws such as cyclicity or reincarnation, and cause and effect or karma, that can be found in all traditions and which we will explore together. And the aim is not to have you believe anything, but to make you discover and explore independently, delving deeper and deeper in a cyclical manner. And you will explore laws such as cyclicity and cause and effect in their context and see what happens when you apply them in your life. And with that, an inner cosmos slowly will open for you, ever further, deeper, and wider. Now, the course is held weekly on Sunday afternoons from 4 p.m. to 6 p.m. Central European time or summertime, online via Zoom, and it runs from November the 2nd through June. And we hope this Sunday afternoon is a time that allows for most people worldwide to attend. And the contribution for the course is 60 euros for all lessons. And this is purely to cover costs, as no one in our organization is paid. Everybody works on a voluntary basis, and we believe that passing on universal wisdom should also never come at a price. So just as the messengers always passed on their inner wisdom to anyone who wanted to hear it or showed themselves to be ready for it. All right, we will now pause for 3 minutes, after which we have time to answer a few questions from the YouTube chat. And after that, we will continue our study in private via Zoom. See you in a few minutes. Okay, welcome back. Hank, are there any questions?
Erwin, no, there are no questions. So we can go to the whole forum.
Yeah, great. Then we will continue via Zoom. Well, of course, first of all, the course we already talked about. So yeah, again, if you're interested, please check, where do I have it? blavatskyhuis.org/courses, so our website. Then next week, Barend will continue talking about awakening the inner human being. Yeah, we will also, Barend probably will tell more about also the course, because that are some other aspects of the course we will focus on, focusing on our inner powers. So yeah, please be there next week, and we hope also to see you again next week with the study. And then, like we always do, we end with the Gayatri, a call to the highest part in ourselves that knows that it's united with the all, the one, the boundless, the golden sun. O thou golden sun of most excellent splendor, illumine our hearts and fill our minds, so that we, recognizing our oneness with the divinity which is the heart of the universe, may see the pathway before our feet and tread it to those distant goals of perfection, stimulated by thine own radiant light.